Hey everyone, how's it going? Let me know if you can hear and see me all right. I just had to double check a couple of things on my microphone and video side of things, so if you hear live, feel free to let me know in the comments. But I hope everyone's doing well. Today is going to be another live stream, so if you haven't been onto one of these before, welcome to another Pushing Film live stream. This one is going to be a book sharing live stream, something that I've done quite a few times now. I really fallen in love with the idea of sharing books that I really like with some of you guys and getting you exposed to the great work of photographers like today's photographer, Joel Meyerowitz, and his book, Where I Find Myself. So maybe you have a copy of this book and you're just watching along to get a different perspective on it, or maybe you've never heard of Joel Meyerowitz, which I think would be a great introduction to him through this book. So stick around and let me know what you've been up to while we wait for the live stream to populate a little bit. Let me know, what have you been photographing? What have you been photographing with? I've personally been doing a fair bit of street photography, which probably might have inspired my decision to share this particular book. And I've been shooting a lot of street on my Leica MA, which is the main camera I use for street photography. And especially using a lot of Fuji Superior 400 lately, but no particular reason except that it's sort of a cheap and accessible film and I get nice results out of it, and it's 400 speed, which is always good on the street. I can find myself easily able to rate it at 320 to 400 and get good results and colors and contrast. And a little bit of Ektachrome too. What I currently have in the camera is some Ektachrome because, again, maybe being inspired by the photographers who shot a lot of slide film, including Joel, and I'm sure many others that I'm a big fan of, such as Alex Webb, Harry Guriart, and various photographers. So trying a bit of slide in the MA at the moment. All right. Telling me that the bitrate is a bit low, but whatever. It seems to always say that. So, this particular book, Where I Find Myself, is a retrospective of Joel Meyerowitz's work. And if you're not familiar with him, he was a photographer who started to actively work in the early 60s. And there's some really interesting stories that he shares in quite a few interviews. And a few of them I'll link in the description, where he talks about how he first got into photography. It's quite a fascinating story. He worked at an ad agency, and then he saw Robert Frank working as a photographer, and he was sort of instantly inspired by watching Robert Frank do his work, and he decided to quit his job then and there, get a camera, go out and start taking photographs on the street. And he even talks about how, later on he actually bumped into Henri Cartier-Bresson on the street, so a lot of interesting serendipitous stories that Joel has to share. So I highly recommend, if you're not familiar with him, check out some interviews. And I've linked two recommended sort of viewings, two videos in the description of this live stream. One of which is quite an old one from 1981, and it's an interview he did back then. And another interview, which is a much more recent one, I think from maybe this year or last year, which is the one under the Leica interviews. I'm not sure what it's called, but it's an interview with sort of the Leica as one of their channels. But it's a really great interview, really insightful. It's a nice long one. Joel goes into depth of sort of, his journey throughout photography. And the reason I chose those particular two on the far ends of his sort of career is because it reflects kind of what you will find in this book. It's like a retrospective where he takes you through from the beginning of his journey in photography to the very latest type of work he's done in the more recent decade. So yeah, I chose those two videos as recommended viewing to really give you an insight into Joel's personality. He's a really eloquent speaker. He's very poetic in the way he talks about photography and, its effect on his life and whatnot. So I definitely recommend checking those out. And otherwise, you'll find plenty of background into his way of thinking in this book itself. So I won't go too much into that here. What I will do though is share with you some of this book to give you an idea of, just what you might find in here, and maybe inform your decision whether or not you're interested in picking up this book. I think personally it's a great photo book to add to any photographer's collection, whether or not you're just a street photographer or you shoot all kinds of things or you're into portraits. I think it's just a really inspiring body of work that's been put together in this particular book that I would definitely recommend to anyone who is into their photo books. And if you're not, this might be a good way to get into them. Anyway, let's switch to this other camera that I normally have set up with these live streams and just give you a quick, not a quick, but I'll try and be quick. I usually say that, but yeah, a bit of an overview of the book. So there's a dust cover on it, which I'll remove for the sake of the live stream. And underneath you'll find a really nice sort of red hardcover of the book. It's quite a large and heavy book, so I think it's just around the size of an A4 letter paper, maybe a little bit bigger. Now on the design of the book itself, it is a little bit, I guess, unconventional with sort of these bright color pages and the red there. And other notes on the layout is that you will find a lot of the images in the book sort of printed across this middle gutter. I'm personally, I don't mind that too much because it's not every single photograph in the book, but I know a lot of people really don't like it when the photos are printed across the gutter, like some of the ones I just showed earlier like that, because it can sort of interfere with your viewing of the photograph, especially with a really big, heavy book like that. You'll find quite a heavy fold in the middle there. So that's just something worth keeping in mind if you're already a bit of a photo book collector and you just wanted to know some of the design aspects like that. Otherwise, the printing is quite nice. I really like the way the photo is printed. The way it's laid out is very intentional. And for the most part, you will find sort of images like this that, they're spread onto their own separate pages. But then, yeah, you do have a fair bit of that throughout the book. And I know some people complain about that. I don't mind it too much. All right, so with this book, as mentioned, it's a retrospective of Joel Meyerowitz's work, and it has a fair bit of text for a photo book. Now, obviously, way more photos than text, but what Joel does in this book is sort of describes different stages of his journey, and it's organized into sort of different categories or chapters, and they're really interestingly named. And you can see here in the, there we go, can you see that? He's divided it into classical and jazz, which is actually an analogy he often uses when describing the different types of his photography, with jazz being the more fast-paced photography, such as the street work that he was known for in the earlier periods from the 60s and 70s and so on. And then he made a transition into actually shooting things like large format 8x10 images of much more quiet, composed scenes, such as the work in his book Cape Light. So that would be the classical stuff, which is the more recent body of work. Even though it is more recent, he did start shooting on the 8x10 from around 76, as you'll see there. Now, the next interesting thing about this book is that it actually takes you in a journey sort of backwards. So it's not chronological as you start the book, but you'll actually start from the most current, series or bodies of work, being 2017 to 2012, and then you'll work your way back in time. But they're divided into these time periods. A lot of these time periods will cross over with each other. So between 2010 and 2001, he was working on this Elemental series, but it did cross over with what he was working on in this period, being photographs of cities, which spanned a very long period of time. So that therefore would cross over with some of this. But I think that's a really interesting approach for a retrospective. And yeah, I was really surprised by that, because I thought it would sort of work its way from the oldest stuff to the most current stuff. But I think because of the general crossover and the long time periods that he's worked on these different series, it shows a lot more about Joel as a personality and how he's sort of changed and evolved throughout his photography. So I've got Ryan Turner in the comments. Hey man, great camera setup, very effective for audience viewing. Thanks. Yeah, it's a bit of a hassle to actually set this up. If you saw my studio right now, you'd see it's a bit of a mess. But yeah, so that's an idea of how the book actually works in terms of structure. So chapter 1, the view from here, which talks about a little bit more of his fine art work and what inspired him to get into fine art. So he'll talk about, you know, whatever the topic is of that section in a little bit of text. Sometimes it's a little bit more extended. And it'll just give you notes on the photograph, sometimes referring to the photograph on the next page, sometimes referring to a photograph, you know, way down the track. So it's very nicely laid out in that sense. But again, if you're not a fan of some of the photos being printed across the gutter, keep that in mind. But my personal opinion is that with a retrospective book like this, where you're trying to fit in as much work as possible, it's not so bad, because then if you, say, for example, really love the large format stuff and decide to look more into that work, or what he did here in Ground Zero, for example, you could then go and get a book on that particular series or type of work that he's done. And same thing with his portraits and street photography work. Joel Meyerowitz has quite a few books out there. So I think this works quite well as an introduction to him as a photographer. And even if you have some of his other work, I'm sure you'll appreciate this. But yeah, chapter 2, The Elemental. I think this one focuses on his time photographing Ground Zero after the September 11 attack, and then being back and forth between New York and Tuscany, which is where he still lives to today, and just sort of juxtaposing some of those scenes that he would see in New York versus the serenity of, you know, say this scene in Tuscany, for example. But yeah, I don't want to spoil too much of any of these chapters for you, so I'm going to just sort of skim through and give you an idea. And then the cities section is what we're probably looking at now. Yeah, and this is where he, you know, would have shot a lot of 8x10 negative, I believe, because at the time it was probably 8x10 negative, which you were getting printed. But amazingly detailed scenes of cities, in also taking a little bit of his inspiration from the way he shot street. So including, you know, incidents or characters or a bit of gesture with a larger overall photograph of something, which is actually a series he did on the Empire State Building, for example, in which you can see it there, just sort of in the background, but with so much content in the one photo. And again, this is part of that Empire State series, where sometimes it'll just be, you know, tucked away in the background somewhere, barely seen, as in with this one. I'm sure you guys would struggle to see that. Same with the arch in St. Louis. Yeah, so really nicely printed. And then taking you through this sort of backwards journey through his work. Again, I'm trying not to spoil too much of this for you guys, but the next section would be his portraits. So the portraits he started doing from around 1980 all the way up till the current time, or the time of printing the book, which I believe 2017. Yeah, so obviously this section talks about his portraits, a lot of which, or maybe all of which, were done on the 8x10 view camera as well. His approach to portraiture, about that connection between himself and the subject, something he's spoken about quite a lot and placed a lot of importance in that element of making a portrait. And even in one of his other books called How I Make Photographs, where he gives sort of advice and lessons on, you know, getting into street photography or photography in general. He talks about the importance of, you know, that connection when making portraits. This is one of his really well-known portraits, where he would have been using quite a slow shutter speed, if you can sort of see from the motion blur in some of these faces that are moving. And there's quite an interesting story behind this one as well, where he told this girl to stay quite still. It wasn't set up per se, but he noticed her, she noticed him, and he just said, stay there right for a second, took the photo, and you have this result here. And a whole lot followed on from that incident as well. Yeah, so portrait section. The world upside down. So I won't explain every single one of these sections in the book, but what I really want to illustrate is what a varied you know, range of photography you'll find in this book and from Joel in general. A really multi-talented photographer with everything that you could sort of classify from being landscape work to street to portraits, and all done so beautifully. between the wolf and the dog. I'm not sure if that's the name of one of his other books. It might be, but it's an expression he uses quite a lot, and he talks about where he first heard that expression being, a saying to describe that time between, afternoon and twilight, I think, and then something being sort of stuck in between those places of being known and unknown, and that metaphor that sort of carries out throughout his work in these photos of pools by the seaside, for example, where the sea, it represents the the unknown, the dangerous, the vast sort of element. So the wolf, and then the dog is the tame aspect, being the pool. So there's a lot of metaphor throughout his work as well that you'll find. But even despite that, they're just beautiful images that I'm sure you'd appreciate just on face value. Cape Light, another one of his books where he shot in Cape Light, or Cape Cod, sorry. These ones I'm a big fan of. This is a book that I'd be interested in getting sometime down the track. I know it's one of his more popular ones. But yeah, you've obviously got a section on that, which is a complete departure, by the way, from his origins in shooting this sort of fast-paced street stuff, being that jazz style that he describes in his interviews and in the beginning of the book. But yeah, we go back towards some street work, letting go of the catch, or this is maybe more about his transition from shooting street up close and more sort of candid, relying on that catch, on that decisive moment, and then letting go of that and composing his street photography because of the transition to color from a little bit further back and including multiple elements within a scene. So he says here, without using the familiar tactics and language of Henri Cartier-Bresson or Robert Frank. So he called these field photographs, where you'd have, every element within that field of view of the camera of having almost equal or equal importance. So all of them sort of, working together in that scene, meaning he had to step back, which he describes as being due to the limitations of moving to color film, which at the time was Kodachrome 25, and he couldn't get that depth of field as you could with color, with black and white. So that means stepping back in order to get enough depth of field, and then opening up this new way of shooting where he can actually include so many interesting elements that play together within one scene. This is one of my favorite sort of parts of this journey of his work. I really love this stage in his street photography, and it's something that I personally find quite inspiring. So just checking some of the comments. Adam, I have this book, not a fan of the photos going across 2 pages. Yeah, okay. So that's what I mentioned in the beginning. I know a lot of people weren't a fan of that, such as with this photograph, because especially in some of those parts in the beginning where because the book is quite heavy, it does really interfere a little bit with the middle of the photo. But like I said, I personally didn't mind it too much, but it's completely understandable where, to the point where I thought I'd make that disclaimer in the beginning. I have a Wim Wenders book, Places Strange and Quiet. I think I have that one. Is it the small blue book? Because, yeah, I recently got that too, the Wim Wenders one, where the wide photos are fold-outs. Works very well. Yeah. No, I think the one I have is called For Real and True. I just have it on that shelf behind me, so I went and checked it. But yeah, despite that, keep that in mind. It is just the way the book is printed. But I think for the amount of work condensed into one book, it does work quite well, and it is a really nice interplay between Joel's text and the photographs that he uses in the book. And some of the spreads are kind of more, strategically made, like this one, where the fold doesn't really interfere with the action in the photograph. And when it's in the middle of the book, it's not as noticeable, I suppose, going across the gutter like that. All right, so this is going a step backwards now again from 68 to 72, where he was, shooting a bit more black and white, and he did his sort of Robert Frank style road trip across America. And he was also shooting color here as well. And this is at the time of the Vietnam War, where there was a mixture of color and black and white, it seems. Yeah, I'll skip ahead a few here. But as you can see, there is quite a large amount of work in this book. On the road. This might have been where he drove around Europe and shot a lot of stuff out of his car. Or it could have just been actually the road trip that he did to, that self-discovery Robert Frank style road trip. Looks more like Europe though. But yeah, there's a lot. Yeah, it's the Europe stuff. There's a lot of content in this book, guys. So that's the one of his most famous photographs. I believe it was the one that was used on the cover, and this was taken in Paris, where it sort of does anchor on this aspect of having an incident, which is where, you know, supposedly this guy just fell over and people were just kind of walking all over him, past him, and not really doing much about it, at least, you know, for that moment. But then still having that style where Joel composes wide enough to kind of tell all the context as well, rather than just having been, you know, cropped in on the incident itself. So that's probably one of the unique, you know, draw cards or the signature looks of his street photography work, is where he is able to step back a little bit and still have the photo be interesting enough through the combination of different elements and context. So stepping back in time yet again, that one's in Turkey. Yeah, this is some of the stuff he shot from a moving car, which is, I find, quite fascinating, on the trail of Robert Frank. Yeah. But yeah, so as we go back in time here, you're starting to see it's more of a focus on that traditional street photography. This being before he made that departure, perhaps, where it is actually more focused on that, what he calls the hook, on the incident, on that decisive moment, without that kind of wider perspective and field style photograph. You missed the fella in grey with the hammer. Did he cause the man to fall into the gutter? All right, so I might have missed a photograph, but that's all right. I didn't want to spoil too much of the book, and you know, save some for anyone who actually decides to buy it. But this section is quite interesting. This is something that in his career at the time was seen as quite unconventional, which is the use of color, because back then color was seen as something more for, you know, amateur use, for shooting slides and projecting them and whatnot. So he actually started shooting with color from the very beginning. And what he did in those earlier years in the 60s was actually shot color and black and white side by side, just to sort of study the difference and what was effective about one or the other. And you can see here some of these examples where you have a black and white and color photograph. And the reason why they're different frames is because what he actually did is carried two cameras, as you would have had to have done back then. It wasn't simply a conversion or whatever you do now. But he had two cameras, one loaded with black and white, one with color. And if he came across a scene which allowed him enough time to take a snap of the scene in one camera, quickly take one in the other, he did that, and therefore presented this sort of, you know, study almost of the strengths and weaknesses, at least when paired with his approach of black and white versus color. And the general argument that he builds is that the color photograph works better because it describes more, you know, than the black and white photograph does, at least in his sort of perspective. And I think in the case of his photographs, the way he sees and what he looks for, color does work in his favor for the most part, at least with scenes like this. And with the few more that you'll see here as I sort of flick through. This one, I'm not sure. This one actually just reminds me a lot of Robert Frank's photo, you know, the one that's on the cover of The Americans. So I'm not sure if I'm predisposed to the black and white look a little bit more in this particular one. But in others, you know, you can see that the color holds more strength of description and of setting the scene and the mood and the atmosphere, such as this one. He talks about how you wouldn't have really gotten the sense of the gloomy day it was outside, and the, you know, the juxtaposition of that feeling of inside and outside, as opposed to the color, the black and white one there. Similar story here with some of these examples, and probably more famously with this one, with the Goodyear blimp. Yeah. So it goes on a little bit with some of those cross-referenced photos, black and white and color, the color argument. And then it goes back, I think, to the very earliest of his work. Again, more of that traditional, closer, decisive moment type of stuff. So you can see he was quite prolific throughout his career, and he is still actively shooting and inspiring and giving talks and classes, and he's someone that I think is definitely worth studying up about a little bit if you're into your photography. And I would definitely recommend this book. Joel Meyerowitz, Where I Find Myself. And even more so than that, you know, if you're not ready to commit to buying a photo book or you're just generally not into books, check out some of his work online. You know, if that's the only way you can see it, check that out. And also some of his interviews and masterclasses. He's done so much that is available for free on YouTube and on other sites, I'm sure. But as I mentioned earlier in the video, in case you missed it, I've included links to 2 recommended videos in the description, and one of which is from 1981, an interesting interview he gave in 1981. You can see how eloquent he is and how he speaks about photography, how much passion he has behind it. And that still carries forward into the interviews he gives today. So the second interview in the description is the Leica Academy one. Not Leica Academy, it's something to do with Leica, but you'll see it in the video description. There's only 2 video links I put there. And that's a much more recent interview that he did from 2020 or even 21. And you can just really feel his passion behind photography, which I think is infectious and inspiring, and just getting into his mind and his thought process. Someone that I think really has that personality to match the work. So let me know what you guys think. Are you a fan of Joel Meyerowitz in general? Are you new to his work? Do you think that you would consider getting this book, perhaps, if you maybe already have some of his other stuff like Cape Light? Let me know what you think. Maybe give me some of your recommendations for other books, including other Joel Meyerowitz books. But just checking back on the comments, I don't think I've really missed too much here. A couple of hellos from Robinson. Hey. Pools by the Sea. Okay, yeah, so that must have been maybe the name of that series that he did of Pools by the Sea. The way Joel speaks about photography is so inspiring. Yeah. All right. So I think I didn't miss anything too much. And as we're approaching the half-hour mark, which is where I try and sum up these live streams, yeah, I think I'll end it there. Get yourself a copy of this book if you're interested. Joel Meyerowitz, Where I Find Myself. It is a more recent sort of book, but I would probably predict that this book will become, once it goes out of print, worth a little bit more than it is now. So it still does go for a fairly decent price. I got mine through Amazon, so I've put an affiliate link to the Amazon source of the book, which is I think around 60 to 70 Australian dollars, maybe 50 US dollars, in the video description. So if you choose to use that link, it does help support me. I get a small cut, even though it doesn't cost you anymore. Otherwise, get it from wherever you want. You know, if you have a local bookstore, even better, support them. But yeah, Joel Meyerowitz, Where I Find Myself. Thanks for tuning in to another book sharing live stream. I look forward to doing the next one. Thanks for all the support on the channel as usual. And yeah, enjoy the rest of your day or night, depending where you are. Thanks, guys. Bye.